Farewell, happy field where joy forever dwells. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The devil is often portrayed as the embodiment of evil, the great tempter who whispers thoughts in your ear that pave the road to hell. Every evening at monasteries around the world, monks sing a prayer that talks of the devil stalking the night, and they ask God for his protection. But one work takes a different approach. It asks how the world looks through the eyes of the devil. How did he come to hate mankind? And what drives his dogged rebellion against heaven? This is John Milton's Paradise Lost, and through its psychological exploration of Satan, it provides great philosophical insight into pride, envy, and rebellion. It is well worth reading, whether you're radically religious or staunchly secular. It is an epic poem telling the story of how Lucifer decided to deceive Adam and Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, causing their fall from heaven, and how Satan led a doomed rebellion against God himself. Get ready to learn the philosophy of the rebel without a cause, how envy can bar you from even a sliver of happiness, and what the French Revolution has in common with Satanism. As always, I encourage you to read the book for yourselves and to examine all of the ideas I present here critically. There is so much I won't be able to discuss in this video, and the poem is truly worth experiencing firsthand. But with that said, get ready to step into the mind of the devil and see what secrets lie inside. 1. The Outrage of Innocence. There is something about the suffering of an innocent that uniquely tugs on our heartstrings. If I showed you someone who just tripped up in the road, you might be tempted to laugh. But if I said they were an orphan who has recently been diagnosed with an allergy to their best friend, a fluffy puppy, then the whole situation takes on a new dimension of seriousness. And this is even more impactful when we perceive ourselves to be an innocent who has been wronged by some stronger or more devious party. We have all been in situations where someone has attempted to make us suffer for basically no reason. This may have been a childhood bully, or an unpleasant partner, or a vindictive boss. The pain we feel is even more pointed because it is accompanied by a perception of deep injustice. Not only did we suffer, but we did not deserve to suffer. It is like rubbing salt in a wound. In his underrated book, The Rebel, Camus identifies outraged innocence as a key factor that creates and develops rebellions and revolutions, both internal and external. Oftentimes, a person or group of people look at the suffering they endure at the hands of another and say, hang on a second. We don't deserve this. And this gives them the moral justification they feel they need to rebel. If someone truly thinks that they deserve their suffering, it's very difficult for them to rebel, because what are they going to push back against? They think the world is exactly how it should be, with a boot repeatedly coming down on their deserving face. However, as Camus freely admits, the relevant factor is not whether somebody is innocent in any so-called objective sense, but rather whether they perceive themselves as innocent. This is what allows them to go from I am suffering to I am suffering and should not be suffering. Not only does this give them a strong motivator to turn on their perceived tormentors, but it also provides them with the rhetoric needed to recruit others. And this self-perceived innocence that has the potential to achieve so much good is twisted in an interesting direction by the character of Satan in Paradise Lost. At the opening of the book, we get a speech from Lucifer himself to a demon horde that is assembled at Hell's capital city, Pandemonium. These names are brilliantly camp. This scene is set after the devil's original rebellion was crushed by the forces of heaven, and he and all his allies were exiled to hell to suffer eternal torment. In his speeches, Satan does not just talk about his hate for heaven, he also waxes poetic about the perceived injustice of them all being damned for eternity. He talks of the suffering of the demons in hell, how they are burned by fire, tortured by the joy of heaven that has been ripped from their grasp. He paints God as a tyrant and he and his allies as underdog rebels who gave their happiness to a lost cause attempting to overthrow an omnipotent dictator. One thing is clear. They are the innocent party. They are the aggrieved. And should the Almighty himself be judged, it is he who would be found lacking. I find this deeply interesting as a way of exploring the philosophy of outrage. That peculiar emotion that occurs when we consider ourselves the innocent, exploited party at the temperamental mercy of a superior foe. Of course, the thing about such emotions is that they are entirely amoral. They can be used for good or evil, whatever you take those terms to mean. And Milton demonstrates just how easy it can be to fool ourselves into thinking that we are pure, innocent souls, uniquely singled out by the universe for particular hardship. Sometimes this outrage can be fantastically helpful. According to Camus, it is part of what galvanized the French Revolution to no longer put up with aristocratic oppression, and it can help people leave situations where they are being abused through no fault of their own. But outraged innocence can just as easily be an exercise in self-deception. We can end up using it as a crutch to justify anything that we do, be that hiding in a corner, failing to take any action to improve our situation and refusing to stand up to a foe, or indulging in excess bloodshed, using our perceived innocence to whitewash every atrocity we commit, all in the name of our rebellious cause. And I love that many of you will probably think that I'm referencing some current event, and lots of you will think that I'm referencing different ones. In reality, I'm not consciously referencing any of them. But I think this goes to show just how relevant Camus and Milton's insights are, even today. By making the devil himself capable of claiming the mantle of the aggrieved innocent party, Milton highlights that almost anyone can trick themselves into thinking that they haven't done anything wrong, and that all fault lies with those against them. And he shows that we are likely to think that whether or not it accords with reality. But there is something about the emotional dynamic between Satan and God, where the devil both rebels against the Almighty and seeks his approval, that is worth exploring. And that's just what we're going to move on to next. But first of all, a word from our sponsors, you. This video is brought to you by my lovely supporters on Patreon, and if you particularly like this video, consider joining them so you can support me making more videos like this. The more support I have, the more I can outsource things like editing and spend more time writing and researching these videos, leading to higher quality end results. But anyway, back to the video. 2. The torture of envy. Bertrand Russell once described envy as the most miserable of all the deadly sins. Nietzsche described it and its cousin resentment as bringing torment in their wake. The ever underrated church father Saint Basil the Great said that the envious person is never free from anguish. It is one of the few things it seems philosophers secular and religious can sing with one accord. Envy is a recipe for misery. And it is easy to see why. If someone is truly envious, then they choose to suffer in the face of someone else's joy. They look at a happy person and they burn with hate, unable to contain their own anger at a fate that has been denied them. And this concept of envy reaches its pinnacle in Milton's Lucifer. In order to enact his plan of corrupting God's newest creation, Satan breaks free of hell and travels across the waves of primordial chaos to land on the shores of the Garden of Eden. There he spies the happy faces of Adam and Eve, enjoying their earthly paradise, filled with love for one another. And at the sight of such happiness, Satan is eaten up with envy, saying, "O hell, what do my eyes with grief behold? Your change approaches when all these delights will vanish, and deliver ye to woe." Satan experiences a deep loss and suffering when he gazes upon the happy humans, because such bliss has been denied him since he rebelled against God. Having lost his joy, he cannot stand for anyone else to be happy either. So seeing the delights of humanity further sets his resolve to cause their downfall. He wants them to join him in hell and deprive them of this paradise, partly out of revenge for the punishments God has given him, but also to soothe his envious mind. And I love this because of how fundamentally relatable it is. We've all had this feeling on some small scale. When we're feeling insecure or down on our luck, it is easy to become inflamed with jealousy at those who seem to be happier. We may even, like Satan, wish and work towards their downfall. But Milton does an excellent job of demonstrating where such a path will probably lead us. It will cause us to commit actions we will later regret, but it will also do nothing to soothe our envy in either case. When Satan returns to hell to tell of his victory, he and all of his other demons are transformed into snakes. Their victory is robbed from them, and they are no better off than where they started. Damned to hell, forbidden to escape, and now having lost their preferred form. It is a fantastic metaphor for the fruitlessness of envy. And there are definitely lessons in here for us all, because envy is such a natural human emotion to feel. In one of my favourite passages from The Gay Science, Nietzsche discusses the human reluctance to show gratitude and their much higher propensity to show envy and resentment. He talks about how gratitude makes us feel like we owe things to others. It betrays our own lack of self-sufficiency and that we are still reliant on other people. Now, undoubtedly, Nietzsche places a high emphasis on actually achieving self-sufficiency, as is clear in his other works. But he also seems to suggest in this passage that if we're going to have to rely on others, we better choose gratitude rather than envy. But the path of envy is much easier because it is vengeful. It turns a difference of circumstance into a metaphysical injustice. Instead of, I recognise someone is more joyful than I am, and I wonder what I can learn from them, we say, someone is happier than I, and this is because the universe is fundamentally out of order. So I must bring them down to my level. It is a much more attractive path because we never have to confront what may be our own inadequacy. This is made more complicated by the fact that sometimes our woes are the result of injustice, but we ought to be pretty sure before we give in to such a destructive mental state. To return to the example of Satan, if he envies and resents the happiness of Adam and Eve and sees it as unjust that he is not similarly happy, then he does not need to confront the reality of his situation, that he has rebelled against God, and so God is not all that keen on letting him take part in divine joy. It turns what could be a moment of self-reflection into one of anger and scorn. And one of the reasons I'm so fond of Paradise Lost is because of the different reactions people have to Satan's envy. Some people see it as entirely justified and paint God as a sort of dictator who flings his archangel out of heaven for an error in judgment. One that could literally do no harm, since it was against an omnipotent being who swats away the rebellion like a fly the moment it inconveniences him. Whereas others see this as analogous to the human tendency to avoid taking responsibility for our own actions when they've brought us misery. The devil has made a poor choice and must now face the inevitable consequences. How sympathetic Satan becomes depends almost entirely on your personal philosophy, which is one of the reasons why this is such a fantastic work. So I will leave it up to you to complete your own personal analyses of the envious state of Satan's mind. Is it the sign of a righteous rebel on the side of justice? Or is it the tantrum of somebody who's finally getting their just desserts? But there is one aspect of Satan's psychology that perhaps more than any other contributes to his internal anguish. It's considered by many to be the worst deadly sin of all. You know it. You love it. It's pride. 3. The inner hell of pride. In Book 4, as Satan is ruminating in the Garden of Eden, we get some of my favourite lines in the poem. Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, and in the lowest deep, a lower deep still threatening to devour me, opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. This short snippet reveals so much about the mind of Lucifer, as we find out that even though he has flown away from hell and is temporarily in a literal paradise, he still cannot find any joy. No matter how hard he tries, he cannot escape his allotted torment, because the source of its sharpest sting is not the lake of fire or the acrid smell of sulphur, but the contents of his own mind. And the cause of his inner torment is, to a large extent, pride. It is, from what little I know, a point of theological tension whether, in Christianity, the devil could in theory be forgiven by God if he truly repented. Saint Anselm famously argued that the devil could not repent, whereas I've seen other people argue that if Satan was truly remorseful, then God would still find it in his heart to forgive him. It's just that the devil would not do such a thing. I am not an expert on Christian theology. As I've said many times, I am just a bloke with some books and a camera. But something I noticed in Paradise Lost is how Satan rejects the very idea of re-entering into the heavenly fold because of, quite frankly, the size of his ego. Perhaps the most famous quote in Paradise Lost is Satan's line, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And this sums up Lucifer's scorn at the mere idea of humility and repentance perfectly. It is a part of his core belief system that he is fit to unthrone God and rule in his place. So the concept of bowing to another is beyond his comprehension. And this pride is what led to his original exile to hell. In Book 6, we get an account of the holy war that took place between Satan and his allies and the forces of heaven. According to the angel Raphael, God the Father unveils his Son, Jesus Christ, and heaps upon him honours and accolades aplenty. Lucifer finds this situation completely and utterly intolerable. It is alluded to that he previously held the Father's favour, and it wounded his pride to think that there might be someone exalted above him. The bitterness caused by this gash in his ego was so great that it motivated him to rebel against heaven itself, damning him in the process. And the tragedy does not stop there. It is largely pride that causes Satan to continue to look for any avenue that will make God suffer, even when they come at the cost of what little happiness he himself has left. It is pride that means that he refuses to accept the idea that he may have made a mistake in trying to unseat an omnipotent deity. And it is pride that makes him dig himself a deeper and deeper hole with his continual misdeeds. He ends Paradise Lost in arguably a significantly worse situation than he began it, prophesies now to be defeated by Christ, and ultimately fall a second time. And all because his pride will not let him accept any situation where he is not exalted and acknowledged, even if that means becoming the crown prince of evil and the firstborn of the damned. This again mirrors something that Camus talks about in The Rebel. He introduces something called metaphysical rebellion, which is where we rebel against existence itself for all of its perceived injustices. It has not granted us what we want out of life, and so we spit in its face and decry it as immoral. Camus is careful to point out that this position is not so much atheistic as anti-theistic. It does not accept the universe as a cold, uncaring place, or else this outrage would be impossible to maintain. It does not so much say there is no God, but rather if there was a God, he would not be worthy of my praise. It may even say I would make a better God than God himself. And I find this concept deeply interesting because it is a position that often goes unacknowledged. It is an opposition to God that is not on scientific grounds, but rather from the foundations of moral outrage. And in its most extreme form, it can manifest as just the sort of pride exemplified in Milton's Satan. Later in his book, Camus is talking about the justification for the reign of terror during the French Revolution made by the Committee for Public Safety. He points out it partly arose from the committee crowning themselves as new moral arbiters. In the new atheistic society of revolutionary France, they needed a new figure to decide the values of right and wrong, and they chose the people. But, more importantly, the people as embodied by the Committee for Public Safety, as headed up by Robespierre. The committee then began its reign of terror with the moral high ground safely assured. According to Camus, it was in part this philosophy that allowed them to commit atrocities with a smile on their faces and a gavel in their hands. Now, you may think that Camus' argument is a bit extreme, but either way, there's an important warning in here for us all. There is a deep danger in becoming too full of pride, both on a personal level, as it may condemn us to the sort of inner hell that Milton's Satan speaks of, but also on a philosophical level, where our pride may become twisted, and we may unwittingly stumble into committing actions we never thought that we were capable of, all in the name of our own pride. Obviously, this is not to say that pride is never useful. It takes a certain level of pride not to put up with abuse or the ill treatment of others. But Milton gives us a glimpse of just how bad things can get when pride spirals out of control. And however likely you think that is, it is certainly a piece of wisdom worth listening to. But we have yet to talk about a very important component to Milton's devil, and one that mirrors a struggle that we all go through on some level. 4. Existential despair. Since the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, people have been asking how to live in the wake of the death of God. As the church was slowly supplanted by modern science as a source of knowledge, and God slowly lost his relevance as a way for people to live their lives with meaning, much of humanity confronted an uncomfortable question. How do we find meaning without God? Some existentialists like Sartre have argued that we could find it in freedom and authenticity. Others have argued that we could replace serving God with serving a community. And then there are people like Camus who want us to move past meaning altogether and embrace the emptiness of life in all its glory. But Milton's Paradise Lost gives us an early peek into these issues by presenting us with a character who is quite literally learning how to live without God. Satan has been exiled from heaven and by extension the company of God. His version of existential angst is arguably even more pointed than our own. We may have to learn to live in a godless world, but Satan has to learn to live in opposition to God. And it is no surprise that he is racked with despair over this challenge. In his own words, "So farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good." The devil, to put it mildly, clearly does not enjoy his life. At no point in the book does he contemplate even for a moment the possibility of long-term joy and satisfaction. He has become so closely embroiled with his suffering that it seems like he wouldn't know who he was without it. Put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to it later. I have mentioned this in other videos, but there's a type of person that Kierkegaard talks about in The Sickness Unto Death that I find endlessly fascinating. It's someone who holds their pain so close to their heart that they become loath to let it go. Where once they hoped for joy, they now resent the very idea that they could be happy, and they demand recognition as the uniquely condemned person, the one all the world should bow down to as supreme sufferer. And this is exactly the sort of reaction that Satan has to his despair. In a lot of existential problems, the main issue is uncertainty or emptiness. We don't know if there's any meaning in the universe, and we worry that our lives are much less significant than they ought to be. But the similar form of despair Satan has stems from having the opposite problem. He faces the issue of being the singular embodiment of everything that opposes God, and such a role permanently bars him from happiness. In Milton's world, it is God that creates all joy, all strength, and all contentment. So in his rebellion, Satan does not just have to reject God as a form of authority, he has to reject the very source of anything that could make him happy. In heaping scorn upon God, he has to heap scorn upon the concept of joy itself. And in some ways, this is analogous to how a lot of people end up feeling. This is just anecdotal, but I see a lot of people, both online and in person, who have begun to see joy as somehow foolish or beneath them, who seem to think that a pessimistic view on life is exactly the same thing as a realistic view on it, who think anyone who believes in the existence of happiness or contentment is some form of idiot. And when we do this, it is often because we are deeply unhappy in ourselves, and we despair at the state of our own lives. So, to bring some small comfort, we pretend that a happy life is either impossible or only fit for stupid people. We may be miserable, we cry into sleepless nights, but at least we're not like the rest of them. Of course, the irony is that in demonizing joy, we cut ourselves off from ever achieving it. By turning happiness into something that is not worthy of us, we guarantee that we will never be worthy of it. Identifying these lines of thinking in Lucifer can make them much easier to discover in ourselves, and this can relieve us of an emotional burden we might not even realize that we're carrying. But there is another, more subtle message here that I really like. As I said before, a lot of human existential angst stems from a perception of meaninglessness or insignificance. We become aware that we will one day no longer exist, and that our lives will have amounted to nothing in the long term. And this prospect terrifies us. But the character of Satan reminds us that it might not be better to actually have existential importance. The Lucifer of Paradise Lost is a creature of cosmic significance, but this does not grant him an ounce of peace. In fact, it seems to needlessly raise the stakes of his life. Every action becomes something to despair over. Every affront to his honour is a matter of salvation and damnation. And I don't know about you, but I think living like that sounds a whole lot worse. We may want our lives to be objectively meaningful, but we should be careful what we wish for. Spiritual significance is not all it's cracked up to be. But there is something about the power dynamic of rebelling against an omnipotent ruler that lends a very interesting dimension to Satan's despair in Paradise Lost. And that is just what we shall discuss next. 5. Hopelessness and Powerlessness. The much-beloved novelist Franz Kafka is best known for inspiring the term Kafkaesque. This word is used to denote many things, but it at least partly relates to that feeling of powerlessness we have when we are up against a huge, incomprehensible structure and are effectively putty in its hands. In the trial, we follow the story of Joseph K., whose entire life is upended by a fictional and inscrutable legal system, which has seemingly unlimited influence over his fate. In some ways, Milton's character of Satan is in the ultimate Kafkaesque situation. He is up against an omnipotent being, and more than that, an omnipotent being who gets to define the boundaries of morality itself. He is on the doomed voyage to end all doomed voyages, and it is fascinating to see the impact this has on his mental state. He often oscillates between being certain that his plan will succeed and that he will somehow achieve his aim of hurting God, and recognizing that everything is doomed from the start. In books 1 and 2, Satan toys with the idea of raising a genuine second rebellion against heaven, but he realizes that it will be crushed without effort in exactly the same way that the first one was, and he teems with hatred at this fact. It is this that gives him the resolve to turn mankind against God. But even this plan is a hollow form of revenge. Satan knows that he will never topple heaven, and so he has to make peace with the best he can get, which is dragging mankind down to hell with him. And even this meagre revenge is only possible because Milton's God allows it. In Book 3 it is revealed that God knows all about Satan's plan and is letting it happen to test mankind's resolve. So everything the devil does is only possible by the consent of the very thing that he hates most. Satan is trapped in a hell quite apart from his physical imprisonment. He wants to rebel against the immutable facts of his universe. He cannot bear the way things are, so he desperately tries to act as if they are different. But deep down, he knows there is no hope for him and no power he has, and this tears him apart inside. There is a brief moment where it seems like the devil might change his tune. Upon spying Eve alone in the Garden of Eden, Satan stops for a moment and admires her beauty. He is so dumbstruck that just for a second he forgets his hatred for God and his scorn for humanity. It almost looks like this could become a sort of turning point for his character, but it is over as soon as it has begun, and Satan's hatred takes hold once again. He is so sure of his path, so convinced that there is no hope for his redemption, that he sees only one way forward. Thus he adds to his material powerless a form of spiritual hopelessness that sets him on a course of action and refuses to let him budge. He regards himself as neither powerful, nor hopeful, nor free, and so he marches onwards to the doom of both him and humanity. In his own words, "Nor hope to be myself less miserable by what I seek, but others to make such as I, though thereby worse to me redound, for only in destroying I find ease." In plain English, Satan recognizes that his quest to hurt God is pointless, and moreover that it will cause him to suffer more in the process. But he presses onward because he doesn't know what else to do. Only in destruction can he find peace, even if that peace cannot possibly last. And it is this that turns Satan into a tragic figure. It's not just his arrogance, his envy, or his hate that dooms him. Any hope of happiness is lost from the start, because he's going up against literal omnipotence. And this is again an aspect of Milton's Satan that we can all relate to. We know what it's like to feel powerless, whether that was as a child when we had very little control over our lives and were too physically weak to act for ourselves, or as an adult where so many of us are tied up into systems that feel impossible to understand, impossible to outwit, and impossible to beat. Milton has successfully turned the Prince of Evil into a relatable character by putting him in a situation most people are familiar with, both today and in the 17th century. It is said that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that may be true, but it is also worth considering that when someone is deprived of hope, deprived of any power over their own lives, they become unpredictable. They can lash out without a moment's warning and without any chance of talking them down. Once someone sees themselves as having nothing to lose, their lives are paradoxically back in their hands, even if happiness is forever out of their grasp. In such a situation, who knows what they will do? Is it so unbelievable that such a person would rebel not just against a society or a morality, but against an omnipotent God? But in my opinion, there is a common thread in the rope that ties Satan to misery, and it is perhaps something that you wouldn't expect. 6. The trap of identity. It feels odd to think of identities as traps. The ability to define ourselves and know our own characters is surely a sign of a healthy mind. And to a certain extent, this is of course true. But the moves of the devil in Paradise Lost bring into full focus the disastrous effects of clinging to a self-destructive identity and viewing it as just a part of who you are. All of the factors I've been talking about thus far, the outraged innocence, the envy, the pride, the despair, the hopelessness, it all serves to do one thing. It causes the devil to adopt an identity that is fundamentally aimed at self-destruction. Of course, once we identify something and take it into our core selves, it becomes very hard to shake. And adopting a self-destructive identity is like strapping a ticking time bomb to our very psyche. Fundamentally, the issue that Milton's devil encounters is that he is not satisfied with simply making a mistake. Each of his mistakes is slowly incorporated into his identity until the only way forward that makes sense is down. There is the overriding idea through all of his monologues that it is somehow too late to turn back from his current path. In Book 10, he returns triumphantly to hell and takes pride in the name Satan, describing himself as the antagonist of heaven's almighty king. The final nail in the coffin of Lucifer's happiness is hammered in place. He is no longer rebelling against God out of envy or out of despair, but simply because it is who he is. He now sees it as an immutable characteristic. The very behaviours that bring him misery have become the ones that he cannot live without. He would not even know who he was anymore if he was not the arch-sufferer, locked in an eternal exercise of futile rebellion against omnipotence. And I think many of us can recognise a piece of ourselves in this psychological move. Having a strong personal identity can be fantastic, but we should also bear in mind that making something an aspect of ourselves is a way of freezing it in place. It singles out a property of us as incapable of change. This is part of the reason why we can become so upset when a portion of our core identity is threatened. It is not just irritating, it's downright disorienting. We feel like we don't know who we are anymore, and our minds spin off outside of our control or comprehension. So one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves is what properties we want to identify with. In early Buddhist thought, some people considered that we should not take on any property into our core sense of self, because of the potential for suffering that I have just described. But even if we don't want to go this far, it is still worth being conscious about just what properties we are slowly beginning to identify with. It is so easy to let our identities craft themselves without any conscious interference, and this is like putting our happiness in the hands of chance. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus used to talk about not identifying with our material possessions or our accomplishments, as this would bring us suffering if we were ever to lose them. But we don't need to get nearly so abstract to hammer home the importance of managing our personal identities. After all, it is the cause of so many everyday self-fulfilling prophecies. We see it in the person who identifies as unlovable, so they never go out and look for it. Or the teenager who is so sure that they are stupid that they never bother to try to learn anything. Or the person who holds their unhappiness as a core part of themselves, and so gives up hope, ensuring their continual despair. We see it shining brightest of all in the character of Satan, who identifies so strongly with his rebellion against God that he clings to the very path that will bring about his own destruction, rather than face the prospect of reconstructing his idea of who he is from the ground up. Sometimes we are so hell-bent on defending ourselves from others that we fail to realise there may be an enemy in our own camp, so close to our heart that we may find them almost impossible to cut out. As always, I encourage you to read Milton for yourself, as there's been so much that I've been unable to cover here. And if you want more on philosophically significant evildoers, click here to learn about Dostoevsky's most terrifying character. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.